The Reign of Terror stands as a pivotal and haunting chapter in human history, a dark testament to the devastating consequences of unchecked power and ideological fervor. This brutal period, marked by the swift and merciless executions of tens of thousands, would forever alter the course of modern politics and society. The shadows of its legacy still linger, a chilling reminder that even the brightest revolutions can descend into darkness. In the late 18th century, France was a nation on the brink of upheaval, its people exhausted by the weight of absolute monarchy, crippling taxation, and social inequality. The Palace of Versailles, once a symbol of French opulence and grandeur, had become a gilded cage, suffocating under the extravagance of King Louis XVI and his queen, Marie Antoinette. As the financial burden of the American Revolutionary War and years of reckless spending took its toll, the French economy teetered on the edge of collapse. The price of bread, a staple for the common people, had skyrocketed, leaving many to face the harsh reality of hunger and desperation. In this tumultuous landscape, the seeds of revolution were sown. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason, individual rights, and democratic principles, had inspired a generation of thinkers and intellectuals, including Maximilien Robespierre, Georges Danton, and Jean-Paul Marat. These visionaries, fueled by a passion for liberty and a disdain for the monarchy, began to organize and agitate, calling for radical change and an end to the ancient regime. As the revolution gained momentum, the National Assembly, a representative body of the Third Estate, emerged as a powerful force, demanding reform and greater representation for the common people. The storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, marked a turning point in the struggle, as a mob of Parisians, fueled by anger and a desire for justice, seized the infamous prison, freeing only a handful of inmates, but symbolically toppling the monarchy's authority. In the aftermath of this pivotal event, the National Assembly adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a foundational document that enshrined the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. However, as the revolution deepened, factions began to emerge, each with its own vision for France's future. The Girondins, led by Jacques-Pierre Brissot, advocated for a more moderate approach, while the Montagnards, dominated by Robespierre and his allies, pushed for more radical measures, including the execution of King Louis XVI. The trial of the monarch, which began in December 1792, would prove to be a defining moment in the revolution. The National Convention, now the ruling body of France, was divided on the question of the king's fate, with some arguing for mercy and others demanding his death. Robespierre, in a passionate speech, argued that the king's execution was necessary to protect the revolution and ensure the survival of the French people. On January 21, 1793, Louis XVI was led to the guillotine, his death marking the beginning of a new era in French history, one that would be marked by violence, bloodshed, and the unyielding pursuit of ideological purity. As the news of the king's execution spread, the European monarchies, already wary of the revolution's radical ideals, began to take action. The War of the First Coalition, pitting France against a coalition of European powers, including Austria, Prussia, and Great Britain, would soon engulf the continent, testing the mettle of the French people and the revolutionary government. As the Committee of Public Safety solidified its grip on power, Robespierre, with his unwavering dedication to the revolution's ideals, emerged as a dominant force. His speeches, laced with passion and conviction, mesmerized the National Convention, and his influence extended far beyond the confines of the Assembly Hall. The committee, now the de facto ruling body of France, began to wield its power with ruthless efficiency, dispatching agents to the provinces to root out counter-revolutionary activity and eliminate perceived enemies of the state. One such agent was Jean-Lambert Tallien, a young and ambitious revolutionary who had risen through the ranks of the committee. Sent to the province of Bordeaux, Tallien was tasked with suppressing the growing federalist movement, which sought greater autonomy for the regions and opposed the centralized authority of the Committee of Public Safety. With calculating precision, Tallien set about his work, using a combination of persuasion, intimidation, and violence to quell the opposition. His methods, though brutal, were effective, and soon the Federalist movement in Bordeaux was all but extinguished. Meanwhile, in Paris, The committee's campaign against perceived enemies of the revolution gained momentum. The Law of Suspects passed on September 17, 1793, granted the committee sweeping powers to arrest and detain anyone suspected of counter-revolutionary activity. The law's vague wording and broad scope allowed for rampant abuse as neighbors denounced neighbors and former friends turned against one another. The prisons of Paris, once relatively empty, soon swelled with suspects, many of whom would never face trial or learn the charges against them. As the reign of terror deepened, the committee's attention turned to the perceived enemies within its own ranks. Jacques-René Hébert, a radical journalist and politician, had long been a thorn in Robespierre's side, advocating for even more extreme measures against the revolution's enemies. However, his influence had begun to wane, and Robespierre saw an opportunity to eliminate a potential rival. On March 24, 1794, Hébert and several of his associates were arrested, charged with conspiracy, and swiftly executed by guillotine. The fall of Hébert marked a significant turning point in the Reign of Terror, as Robespierre's power and influence reached new heights. The committee, now more entrenched than ever, continued its relentless pursuit of perceived enemies, both within and outside its ranks. The guillotine, once a relatively rare sight, became a ubiquitous presence on the streets of Paris, its deadly efficiency a grim reminder of the revolution's unyielding commitment to ideological purity. As the summer of 1794 approached, the Reign of Terror would enter its most intense and violent phase, with Robespierre at the helm, guiding the revolution toward an uncertain and bloody destiny. In the midst of this chaos, a young woman named Rose de Frey, a former noblewoman turned revolutionary, found herself caught in the committee's crosshairs. Her husband, a prominent Federalist leader, had been executed earlier that year, and Rose was now suspected of counter-revolutionary activity. Arrested and imprisoned, she would soon face the dreaded Committee of Public Safety, where her fate would be decided by the very men who had once championed the revolution's ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. As Rose de Frey sat in her damp, dimly lit cell, she couldn't help but think of the fate that had befallen her husband. The memory of his execution still lingered, a painful reminder of the committee's ruthless efficiency. Her own arrest had been swift and unexpected, the result of a tip from a neighbor who had denounced her as a counter-revolutionary. The committee's machinery was well-oiled, its members working tirelessly to process the countless cases that flooded their offices. Robespierre, ever the driving force behind the committee, had become increasingly obsessed with rooting out perceived enemies of the revolution. His speeches, once filled with passion and conviction, now took on a more sinister tone, as he railed against the internal threats that he believed threatened the very fabric of the revolution. One such threat, in Robespierre's eyes, was the growing influence of Georges Danton, a former ally who had begun to speak out against the committee's excesses. Danton, once a powerful figure in the National Convention, had grown increasingly disillusioned with the Reign of Terror, and his criticisms of the committee had not gone unnoticed. Robespierre saw him as a rival, a potential challenge to his own authority, and he was determined to silence him. On March 30, 1794, Danton was arrested along with several of his associates, including Camille Desmoulins, a journalist and politician who had been a vocal critic of the committee. The charges against them were vague, but the outcome was all but certain. They would be tried, found guilty, and executed. The trial itself was a farce, with the outcome predetermined by the committee. Danton's defense was passionate but ultimately futile, as he railed against the committee's tyranny and the hypocrisy of its members. As the trial drew to a close, Robespierre delivered a scathing indictment of Danton, portraying him as a corrupt, power-hungry individual who had sought to undermine the revolution. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Danton and his associates were found guilty, and on April 5, 1794, they were led to the guillotine, their executions marking a significant turning point in the Reign of Terror. The fall of Danton marked the beginning of a new phase in the Reign of Terror, one characterized by even greater ruthlessness and paranoia. Robespierre's power was now unchecked, and he used it to eliminate any perceived threats to his authority. The committee's agents roamed the countryside, seeking out enemies of the revolution, while the prisons of Paris overflowed with suspects, many of whom would never face trial or learn the charges against them. In this atmosphere of fear and mistrust, The Committee of Public Safety continued its relentless pursuit of perceived enemies, both within and outside its ranks. The law of suspects remained in force, its broad scope allowing for rampant abuse as neighbors denounced neighbors and former friends turned against one another. As the spring of 1794 wore on, the committee's attention turned to the provinces where opposition to its rule was growing. In the city of Lyon, a major center of resistance, the committee's agents had been working tirelessly to suppress dissent, using a combination of persuasion, intimidation, and violence to quell the opposition. The city's inhabitants had suffered greatly under the committee's rule, with thousands arrested, imprisoned, or executed on suspicion of counter-revolutionary activity. One such inhabitant was a young man named Claude Bernard, a former merchant who had been arrested in February 1794 on suspicion of hoarding grain. His trial had been a sham, with the outcome predetermined by the committee's agents. One notable example of the committee's brutality in Lyon was the execution of Jacques-René Hébert, a radical journalist who had once been a close ally of Robespierre. However, Hébert's increasingly extreme views and criticisms of the committee had made him a target for persecution. On March 24, 1794, he was arrested along with several of his associates and put on trial. Hébert and his co-defendants were found guilty and executed by guillotine on April 5, 1794. The execution of Hébert marked a significant turning point in the Reign of Terror, as it signaled the beginning of a new phase of violence and repression directed against the ultra-revolutionaries who had once been allies of Robespierre. The committee's agents continued to purge the cities and towns of France, seeking out anyone suspected of counter-revolutionary activity or disloyalty to the regime. In Paris, the committee's attention turned to the remaining Girondin deputies who had been arrested in June 1793. Although many had already been executed or had died in prison, a handful remained, including Jean-Sylvain Bailly, the former mayor of Paris. On November 12, 1793, Bailly had been put on trial and found guilty of treason. He was executed by guillotine on November 12, 1793, but several other Girondin deputies remained in prison awaiting their fate. One such deputy was Jean-Baptiste Boyer-Fonfrède, who had been arrested in June 1793 and imprisoned in the Luxembourg prison. Despite his imprisonment, Boyer-Fonfrède continued to speak out against the committee's tyranny, and his criticisms did not go unnoticed. On April 18, 1794, he was put on trial along with several other Girondin deputies, including Charles Barbaroux and Nicolas-Marie Quinet. As the Reign of Terror continued to intensify, the committee's agents turned their attention to the French army, where opposition to the regime was growing. In March 1794, a group of army officers had been arrested on suspicion of counter-revolutionary activity, including General Charles-François Dumouriez, who had defected to the Austrians in April 1793. Although Dumouriez had already escaped to Austria, several other officers remained in prison, awaiting their fate. One such officer was General Alexandre de Beauharnais, who had been arrested in March 1794 on suspicion of treason. Despite his loyalty to the revolution, Beauharnais had fallen out of favor with Robespierre, who saw him as a potential threat to his authority. On July 23, 1794, Beauharnais was put on trial, along with several other army officers, and found guilty of treason. He was executed by guillotine on July 23, 1794, marking another significant turning point in the Reign of Terror. As the summer of 1794 wore on, the Reign of Terror continued to intensify, with Robespierre's Committee of Public Safety exerting ever greater control over the French government and society. One of the key targets of the committee's wrath was the French army, where opposition to the regime was growing. In July 1794, a group of army officers who had been arrested on suspicion of counter-revolutionary activity were put on trial, including General Louis-Marie Stanislas Fréron, who had been a prominent Jacobin leader but had fallen out of favor with Robespierre. Despite his Jacobin credentials, Fréron was found guilty of treason and executed by guillotine on July 25, 1794. The execution of Fréron marked a significant turning point in the Reign of Terror, as it signaled the beginning of a new phase of violence and repression directed against former allies of Robespierre, who were now seen as threats to his authority. The committee's agents continued to purge the army of anyone suspected of disloyalty, with hundreds of officers being arrested and executed in the following weeks. Meanwhile, in Paris, The Committee of Public Safety was facing growing opposition from within the National Convention, the French legislature that had been established in 1792. A group of deputies, known as the Thermidorians, who were opposed to Robespierre's regime and wanted to bring an end to the Reign of Terror, began to secretly conspire against him. The leader of the Thermidorians was a deputy named Paul Barras, who had been a close ally of Robespierre but had become disillusioned with his increasingly tyrannical behavior. On July 26, 1794, Barras and his fellow Thermidorians launched a surprise attack on Robespierre and his allies in the National Convention. The debate was heated and chaotic, with Robespierre attempting to defend himself against the accusations of the Thermidorians. However, he was ultimately unable to withstand the onslaught, and on July 28, 1794, he was arrested along with several of his closest allies, including his brother Augustin and their friend Georges Danton. The fall of Robespierre marked the beginning of the end of the Reign of Terror, but it did not mean an immediate end to the violence and repression that had characterized the period. The Committee of Public Safety continued to function, albeit in a weakened state, and many of the officials who had been responsible for the terror remained in power. However, the arrest of Robespierre created a power vacuum that would eventually be filled by new leaders who were determined to bring an end to the Reign of Terror and establish a more stable and moderate government. In the following weeks, the National Convention established a new committee known as the Committee of Justice, which was tasked with investigating the crimes committed during the Reign of Terror and bringing those responsible to justice. The committee was led by a deputy named Jean-Lambert Tallien, who had been a prominent Thermidorian and was determined to see that those responsible for the terror were held accountable. As the Committee of Justice began its work, it became clear that many of the officials who had been responsible for the Reign of Terror would face severe punishment. The committee issued arrest warrants for dozens of former members of the Committee of Public Safety, including several who had been close allies of Robespierre. The most prominent of these was Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just, who had been one of the leading architects of the Reign of Terror and had played a key role in the downfall of many of its victims. On July 28, 1794, Saint-Just was arrested along with several other former members of the Committee of Public Safety, including Pierre-Louis Bentabelet and Jean-Baptiste Loys. The four men were put on trial, where they were accused of a range of crimes, including murder, theft, and corruption. The trial was a dramatic and intense affair, with the defendants attempting to defend themselves against the accusations of the prosecution. In the end, all four men were found guilty and sentenced to death by guillotine. They were executed on July 29, 1794, in a dramatic and symbolic gesture that marked the end of the Reign of Terror and the beginning of a new era in French history. The execution of Saint-Just and his fellow defendants was seen as a major milestone in the transition from the radical Jacobin regime to a more moderate and stable government, and it paved the way for the eventual rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, who would go on to dominate French politics for over a decade. As the summer of 1794 drew to a close, France was still reeling from the aftermath of the Reign of Terror. The country was exhausted, divided, and traumatized by the violence and repression that had characterized the period. However, with the fall of Robespierre and the execution of his allies, there was a sense that a new era was beginning, one in which the French people could finally begin to rebuild and heal after the trauma of the previous 2 years. The National Convention, which had been the seat of power during the Reign of Terror, began to take steps to establish a more stable and moderate government. A new constitution was drafted, which established a 5-man executive council known as the Directory. The Directory was tasked with governing France and restoring order and stability to the country. However, the transition from the radical Jacobin regime to the more moderate Directory was not without its challenges. Many of the officials who had been responsible for the Reign of Terror remained in power, and they continued to exert significant influence over French politics. The Thermidorians, who had played a key role in bringing down Robespierre, were determined to see that those responsible for the terror were held accountable. But they faced significant opposition from former Jacobins who were determined to protect their allies and maintain their grip on power. As the Directory took power, it faced significant challenges in restoring order and stability to France. One of its first tasks was to deal with the aftermath of the Reign of Terror, including the fate of those who had been imprisoned or forced into hiding during the period. Many of these individuals, including prominent figures such as Madame Roland and Olympe de Gouges, had been executed or died in prison, but others, like Charles Barbaroux and Jean-Sylvain Bally, had managed to survive. The Directory established a series of commissions to investigate the crimes committed during the Reign of Terror and to provide compensation to victims and their families. One of these commissions, led by Jean-Lambert Tallien, was tasked with investigating the activities of the Committee of Public Safety and bringing its former members to justice. The commission's work was slow and difficult, but it eventually led to the arrest and trial of several high-ranking officials, including Fouquier Tinville, the notorious prosecutor who had sent thousands to their deaths during the Terror. In addition to dealing with the aftermath of the Reign of Terror, the Directory also faced significant challenges in restoring France's economy and international relations. The country was deeply in debt, and its trade relationships with other European nations were severely strained. The Directory attempted to address these problems through a series of economic reforms, including the establishment of a new currency, the franc, and the creation of a national bank. Despite these efforts, however, France's economy continued to struggle, and the country remained isolated from the rest of Europe. The Directory's foreign policy was also marked by controversy and failure, particularly with regard to its relations with Great Britain. The two countries had been at war since 1793, and the Directory's attempts to negotiate a peace treaty were repeatedly rebuffed. As the Directory struggled to address these challenges, it also faced growing opposition from within France. Many of the country's citizens were dissatisfied with the new government and its policies, and there were frequent protests and demonstrations against the Directory. The most significant of these took place in September 1797, when a group of royalist insurgents attempted to overthrow the government in a coup d'état. The coup was ultimately unsuccessful, but it highlighted the deep divisions within French society and the ongoing instability of the country's politics. The Directory responded to the threat by purging its ranks of suspected royalists and by taking steps to strengthen its control over the military and the police. Despite these efforts, however, the Directory's position continued to weaken, and it was eventually overthrown in a coup d'état led by Napoleon Bonaparte in November 1799. Bonaparte, who had risen to prominence as a military leader during the French Revolutionary Wars, established a new government known as the Consulate, which marked the end of the French Revolution and the beginning of the Napoleonic era. The fall of the Directory and the rise of Napoleon marked a final phase of the Reign of Terror's aftermath. The period that followed was one of significant change and upheaval, as France underwent a series of transformations that would shape its politics, economy, and culture for centuries to come. The legacy of the Reign of Terror continued to be felt, however, and its impact on French history and society remained profound. In the years that followed, many of those who had been involved in the Reign of Terror, either as perpetrators or as victims, attempted to come to terms with their experiences and to rebuild their lives. Some, like Maximilien Robespierre's brother Augustin, went into exile, while others, like Paul Barras, one of the leaders of the Thermidorian reaction, attempted to rehabilitate their reputations and to play a role in the new government. The city of Paris, which had been at the heart of the Reign of Terror, also underwent significant changes during this period. Many of the buildings and landmarks that had been associated with the Terror, such as the Conciergerie and the Place de la Révolution, were renovated or destroyed, and new monuments and memorials were erected to commemorate the victims of the period. As the years passed, however, the memory of the Reign of Terror began to fade, and it was gradually replaced by a new set of historical narratives and myths. The French Revolution, which had once been seen as a heroic and liberating event, came to be viewed in a more nuanced and complex light, and the Reign of Terror was increasingly seen as a tragic and regrettable episode in the country's history. The last remnants of the Committee of Public Safety's apparatus were dismantled, and many of its former members were either executed or exiled. The guillotine, which had been the symbol of the Reign of Terror, was finally retired, and a new era of French history began to unfold. The Reign of Terror, a period of unrelenting violence and fear, left an indelible mark on the fabric of French history, shaping the course of modern democracy and serving as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and ideological extremism. Thank you for joining me throughout this historical journey. That's all for today's History with Herodotus. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, remember that, to understand the present, we must first understand the past.